What's going on, guys? Welcome back. Today I want to talk to you about injectors and injector data and the importance of injectors and injector data. So first off, the aim of this video is just to sort of educate the general enthusiasts out there. I'm going to try and not overcomplicate things and try and keep things as simple and quick as possible to get the point across. Second thing I'd like to point out is that you should definitely be talking to your tuner about what injectors your tuner would like you to run for your setup prior to purchasing injectors. I'm here to just try and educate generally, but you should be consulting your tuner with all these things prior to making any purchases or decisions based on what your tuner wants to do. So as tuners, we're seeing more and more of a trend of how important injector data is now becoming in the aftermarket. For aftermarket PCMs and ECUs, OEMs have been using a very effective method of fuel modeling for many years, because OEMs have obviously millions and millions and millions of dollars to R&D this sort of thing, where aftermarket, using a much smaller R&D budget, usually takes a few years to catch up. But being that we do tune so many stock OEM ECUs from things like GM, a lot of Commodores, E38s, plus the older Gen 3 ECUs, we have seen this for a long time. We've been using their modeling for a long time and sort of understanding how that works, and we're seeing it now starting to trickle down into the aftermarket with the way ECUs are starting to use their modeling. Now, the way that this modeling works is so based around your fuel data, your fueling data and injector data, that it is almost, it's not impossible, but it is really hard to get a good tune if you don't have good injectors and you don't have good injector data. Like I said, as we're seeing moving forward, this is becoming just as important now with aftermarket ECUs as it is with the older OEM ECUs that we're already using this very effective modeling. So one thing a lot of people, not so much probably don't understand, but probably take for granted, is the fact that in a perfect world, if your ECU's got a really good fuel modeling system, if you have perfect injector data, you can mathematically tune a car. You should, in theory, if you have perfect injector data, you should be able to mathematically come up with a VE map to tune a car mathematically, and it should work. However, this is almost never the case, which is why we have so many offsets and things to combat this. But having good injector data versus not having good injector data for these ECUs, the way they're modeling now, can mean the difference between a 2-day tune or a 6-hour tune. And I'll explain how as we go forward. So first thing, you need to look at how an injector actually works. They're a pretty simple thing. Obviously, I'm sure there's probably many that a lot of people would add to this, but like I said, I'm trying to keep this sort of simple. So what you've got is your injector body with your electrical connector. Your fuel rail feeds it either from the side or from the top, side feed versus top feed. There's not a lot of great side feed injectors on the market, and you should probably be staying away from them, in my opinion. The point is that that's how injectors get fed fuel. And then you've got usually a basket with a little filter in the top to try and filter the fuel through the injector, make sure there's not any crap or anything getting in there that shouldn't be getting in there. In the injector, you've got an electrical coil, an electromagnetic coil, I should say. And then there is usually a valve with a seat, and then a return spring as well. And the idea is that when you apply electricity to the coil, it pulls the valve open, allows your fuel to spray through the injector, out the pintle, and then the spring obviously then closes the valve on the injector. Now, what the insides of these injectors are made out of is very important. We're seeing, as time goes on and we're getting better and better injectors on the market, pretty much most people are using stainless steel or something just as effective to combat corrosion, because as far as ethanol fuels and that sort of thing goes, they are very prone to corrosion with these sorts of fuels because of the water that's in them. So what you're going to have is, if you don't have like a stainless steel valve or seat and you've got something that's going to get corrosive, you're going to have injectors that then don't seal properly because your valve and seat are corroded. You're going to get injectors that seize shut and get stuck. It's not a very good time. Even we've always told people to stay clear away from gas injectors. There was a long time there where obviously very large petrol injectors were not really there yet, and there was a lot of big volume gas injectors which people were trying to use. The problem with that is, being a gas injector, on the valve they usually have some sort of rubber seal, which with liquid fuels does swell, and this completely changes the characteristics of the injectors once these swell up. So that's why we've always been stay away from natural gas injectors, period. And at this stage, most really good injectors that you're going to be buying, which you should be buying because you shouldn't be buying bad ones, most of these sorts of injectors are made with stainless steel components so that they are corrosion resistant and built to last and able to withstand whatever fuel you want to flow through them. So the way the injector works, you apply the electrical load to the solenoid and it pulls the valve open. The problem with this is that there is a latency. So the ECU can only ground the signal. It'll most ECUs these days are negative triggers, which means they just apply a ground to that cylinder, which obviously applies an electrical load to the injector, and it pulls the valve open. But obviously the valves have weight, there's pressure with fuel, things are happening there that are, there's latency. It's not instant, there's not an instant opening. And that's what you have as far as injector data goes. Now, depending on what sort of voltage your injector is seeing, is going to change, obviously. Higher voltage generally means that you're going to open that valve faster. As the voltage drops, generally speaking, that valve is going to open slower and slower. And that is what your injector data is a lot to do with. Obviously, you've got flow rates, which is very important, but your dead times is what they call it. Most ECUs are calling it dead times. Can also be offset. Either way, what that data is you telling the ECU how long it takes at that voltage for the electrical load applied to open that valve. So you will have an overall pulse width, which is how long the ECU is applying power to the injector, and the effective pulse width is the overall pulse width minus the offset or the dead time, because obviously you're telling the ECU that for 1.2 milliseconds of it applying that power to that injector, it is not actually injecting fuel, because that's how long it's taking to open the valve. Now, if you're just tuning a car for power only, if you're just doing power runs, it's pretty easy to tune around this. You know, you're just going to basically adjust for this in the VE map. You've got a pretty large injector window because you're using a lot of fuel. It's pretty easy to tune around that and use adjustments to properly get the car tuned. It's like we always talk about, guys, tuning a car for power is pretty much the easiest part of tuning a car. The issue you're going to have is if you've got really large injectors in a street car that you want to be street driving, something like a 1650cc injector in, say, a Commodore, for example, your effective pulse width at idle with such a big injector, and those cars do run 4-bar fuel pressure, so you know we are talking about lots of pressure, big injectors. Your effective pulse width at idle can be down to, you know, sort of 1.2 to 1.5 milliseconds. It's very, very small window. So as you can imagine, if your injector data, if your offset or your dead time is incorrect, even if it's 10% out, for a 1650cc injector, that is going to make a huge amount of difference at idle. So if you've got a car that you can't get to idle properly, if you've got a car that won't cruise properly, it's all over the place, closed loop, can't figure out what it's doing, it's up and down, generally it means that your injector data is not correct. And what's happening is you're injecting a lot more or a lot less fuel than the ECU was expecting because the dead time is wrong. So as you can imagine, if you're only using a 1.2, 1.5 millisecond window for effective pulse width, if your injector dead time's out by 1 millisecond, that can be, you know, 30, 60% of the effective pulse width, which is going to cause havoc when you're trying to get a car to idle and drive properly at low pulse widths. So not only this, but as we talked about, with these ECUs becoming so effective with their modeling, like I said, a lot of these OEM ECUs have been doing this for 20 years because they've had so much R&D and so much money thrown at them, and the way that they model their fuel is so good, but it's so dependent on your injector data. And now we're seeing that start to trickle down. You know, Motec has always had a very good modeling system. Adaptronic used XTAU and got their modeling system really well, and that's sort of carried on over with Haltech now in their fuel film model. So we're now seeing even in Haltech, the way they model their fueling is so accurate, provided that you have good injector data. So the other thing is things like flex fuel. You know, you can pretty obviously see on a flex fuel tune if your injector data is wrong, and it's the same thing because the ECU is so well modeled and they know the difference in characteristics between something like ethanol and petrol. Generally, if your injector data is right, once you have your petrol tune, you can go to ethanol and it should be pretty damn close, provided you've got good injector data and everything's correct. If you don't, you're going to have E85 all over the place. It's going to be way rich or way lean, and that's going to be a clear indication that your injector data is all incorrect. And then guess what? You got to start retuning essentially a second fuel map. You essentially have to pretty much start again and tune a whole new fuel map, whole new VE map to account for that difference. So we do see it all the time, and you will see it in the VE map once you finish the tune or while you're doing a tune. You can definitely see how bad the injector data is compared to what the injector is actually doing. You know, if you've got good data and everything's right, you should get a really nice, smooth, correct looking VE map. But if your injector data is wrong, you'll end up with holes, peaks, things that are not happy and not right, and it'll be very obvious in the VE map. So with all this being said, as you can imagine, when you've got an ECU that's so model based on the fuel modeling, if you have good injectors and good injector data, something like Haltech's base file, a lot of their base tunes, if you put the correct data in and it matches the injectors that you have installed on the vehicle, it's not that big of a deal to tune, as in like it doesn't take very long because the modeling is very good. Even in a flex fuel situation, your modeling is going to be very good and it's going to be a pretty quick tune. And that's what I'm talking about if you buy bad injectors that don't come with good data, you give them to your tuner could spend days trying to get your tune right, trying to get your injector data characterized properly so that your tune's correct. Whereas if you provide good injectors, or your tuner provides good injectors with very accurate data, it could be, you know, as little as 4 or 5 hours and full flex tune done, ready to go. Cold start's usually pretty bang on because the injector data's right. You know, if your injector data's out, your cold start, even after you've done your full VE map and full tune, you're going to have bad cold start, you're going to have all sorts of different things going wrong, and you're just essentially not going to have a very well performing tune. So like I said, guys, because we do so many E38s, Gen 4, you know, GM PCMs here, we've been dealing with this whole idea of having very accurate data and good fuel modeling for a very long time. And our go-to injectors for this situation, and it is very important with some of these older OEM ECUs, particularly the Gen 3 LS ECU. If you want to do something like flex fuel, there is only one OS that is capable of being MAFless 2-bar and flex fuel for a boosted application on a Gen 3 PCM. And in that software, or in that OS I should say, there is not a lot of adjustability for the flex fuel. Basically, the way that they have this ECU is modeled, you're pretty much doing your tune on the 98, and the ECU is saying that I should be able to put E85 in this, read it off the ethanol sensor, and the modeling should be good enough that it should go. So because of that, there's not a lot of adjustments that we have. So if you are trying to do a flex fuel situation on a Gen 3 PCM in Commodore, if you don't have good injector data, it's simply just not going to be safe. What you end up having to do is basically trying to find a happy medium between the two, but it's always a compromise for one of the fuels. Whereas if you have really good injector data, everything's sweet, you're all good. And again, speeds up the process. It's really, really easy. Now, a go-to injector lately for this reason has been this brand, XS by Expert. Now, these injectors each come characterized for each set. They come with individual data for the set that you buy, and it is as accurate as you can get. It's the most accurate we've found on the market. Like I said, if you put these in something like a VE, an E38, you have good data. All your data's correct, your slopes are correct, your offsets are right. It is very simple process to tune the fueling of the car. They generally idle well, drive nice, really, really easy to control. And obviously at short pulse widths, they are doing the job really well. Whereas if you go buy a generic injector, I don't want to name names, I don't want to get in trouble, but even a lot of the good injectors on the market, they do not come with accurate enough data for the way ECUs are modeling these days. And it's not to say that they're a bad injector by any means. A lot of these injectors are very, very good injectors, but the data is just not accurate enough for the way these ECUs are modeling, and you still end up spending a lot of extra time trying to get these tunes perfect than you would otherwise. So as emissions laws become more stringent as we move forward and the aftermarket starts to catch up with all these things, I think it's, you know, we're going to see this becoming more and more important as we go. And for someone like us as a tuner, it is becoming very hard. We can have two cars come in that are completely identical setups. One has a set of these in it. The other has a generic set that doesn't have good data. And you know, one guy forked out the money. These aren't cheap, but they make things so much easier. So one's forked out the money to buy these really good injectors with good data. The other one has cheaped out, gone for the cheaper option, same size injector. Like I said, not necessarily means that they're a bad injector, but they've gone with an injector that doesn't have as good data. And you know, the guy who forked out the money, we got his tune done in 6 hours. The other bloke, it may have taken us 10, 12 hours to get it as good as the last one. So for us, we're really starting to move towards a direction of trying to move towards hourly rate tuning on the dyno to try and entice people to take the right steps and do the right thing. Because it's not really fair that the bloke who forked out $2,000 for these injectors paid the same amount for a tune as the bloke who bought the cheaper injectors, but it took us twice as long to do the bloke who did the cheaper injectors. And you know, at the end of the day, if you're doing the right thing, you're buying the right injectors, it should be that you're saving us time, doesn't cost you as much. And I think you're going to see a lot of that moving forward with tuners, the way that the ECUs are going with their modeling and how important this is becoming. It's sort of starting to seem like the only way to make things fair is to not have any sort of flat rates for tunes for this reason, because like I said, it's not fair. But anyway, the flip side of that is most tuners that are charging you a flat rate are charging you for a certain window of time. If you get If you give them a car with good injectors and good data and they don't have to spend hours trying to characterize your injectors to get your VE map right, you're going to end up with a much better performing car, a much better tune for the time that's spent. If your tuner's charging you a flat rate for that window of time and they've got to spend 4 hours characterizing your injectors to get your VE right, they're only going to have extra bit of time to sort of focus on the rest of the tune, the rest of the car. You're going to end up with a tune that's more rushed, not as much time spent, it's not going to perform as well, and that's ultimately the reality of what it is. And this is just for injectors as well, guys. When you're looking at this fuel modeling, it really takes into account the entire fuel system as well, all over, not just the injectors. You got to make sure you got good regulators that are doing a good job at mitigating pulses. Particularly these V8s, you essentially got 2 odd fire engine banks, which means your pulses and sine waves and stuff that's going on in the rail will be affecting how much volume or what sort of fuel each injector is seeing. I remember listening to a podcast, I think it was a HBA podcast with the bloke that developed ID injectors. This is a couple of years ago now, but he talked about doing a 2-cylinder odd fire engine or a 3-cylinder odd fire engine or something like that. And they ended up having to actually give the ECU separate fuel maps for each injector, because depending on how far each injector was from the regulator, changed the fueling of each injector by up to 20%. So you got same cylinder mass in theory, same injector, both on the same rail, but just because of the way the waves and stuff are happening in the fuel rail, it is changing that fueling over 2 different cylinders by up to 20%, which is massive. So it's not just injectors. Obviously your injectors are some of the most important things, but your whole fuel system, as we move forward, as this modeling becomes more and more prevalent, it is going to become more and more and more important that your entire fuel system, you really dot your I's and cross your T's if you want to get a really good result. Anyway guys, like I said at the very start, by all accounts, you should be talking to your tuner prior to setting up any of your fuel system, in my opinion. If you want the best result you can get with the equipment you're going to be using, use the equipment your tuner knows and wants to use. Use the equipment that your tuner recommends. You should be talking to your tuner before making any of these purchases. Ask your tuner about how you should be setting up your fuel system and what equipment you should be using for your fuel system. You know, we deal with cars every day, different cars, different systems. We know what works, we know what doesn't. So talk to your tuner. That's all I've got to say today, guys. Hope this was pretty informative and educational for you, and buy good injectors. I think we're going to see, moving forward, the way modeling is becoming, I think we're going to be seeing a lot more of these sorts of things on the market, a lot more competition for these injectors. We have found these to be the best for what we've been doing. I know that ID do some very, very in-depth data as well. And there are other companies, obviously, that are doing similar things. But yeah, as we move forward, I think you're going to see it more and more as it becomes more and more important. Thanks for watching. Smash like, smash subscribe. We'll see you on the next one. Peace out. See you. Bye.